I think were primarily Asian troops, and the only ones I remember seeing, which was one day in September when I was helping to post some guards along what used to be called Highway 95. It's East something or other. I meant to look up the number, but I didn't. It kind of ran from Český Budějovice, no, from Karlovy Vary diagonally, close to Pilsen, down to Český Budějovice. And that was a demarcation. And one day, when I was in Strebro, somebody asked me if I wanted to go with him when he posted guards, and we drove up to Tepla and picked up some of our guys there, and then we distributed them along the demarcation line. And when we were going, and all the checkpoints of the Russian and American armies were on the crossroads to Highway 95. And there might be just dirt country lanes or something like that, but the system was one army would have its checkpoint essentially on Highway 95, and the other army would be 2 miles back. The next road, it would be the reverse. If we had been on 95 at this checkpoint, at the next one, the Russians would have been, and our guys would have been 2 miles back. So we were driving down 95, and there were a small group of Russian soldiers, and they were Asians, as I remember it. There were a couple of women with them, and I don't know whether they were soldiers or camp followers, and I think there were a few animals, because one of the surprises, actually I got 2 surprises. I thought the German army was highly mechanized, and after we broke out, I can remember driving along this one road, and the Air Force had caught a German unit on the highway and strafed the hell out. And there were dead horses and dead guys and turned over carts and turned over guns, because it was an artillery unit. And that's when I learned there were horse-drawn units in the German army. Until then I thought it was all armor and blitzkrieg. So the Russian army was even worse off, because they had a lot of horse-drawn stuff, and so probably I saw a horse or two with that group that was walking down. But that was the only time I ever really saw Russian troops out in the open. And when I had the 2 passes to Prague, I was in the back of a truck, and I have no idea what the Russian guards were, probably around Rakachani or somewhere like that, looked like. Dark when we went, dark when we came back, and probably the driver and whoever else was in the front seat were the only people who saw the Russian guards. And I didn't see any in Prague that I remember either.
And where was your unit when the war ended?
In Europe or for real?
For real. When you realized you were.
Oh, well, we were in Vimper, because I can remember being in my room in this hotel on the corner of the square, and it was sometime in the afternoon, and probably the Army had a radio network, Armed Forces Network or something, and somebody, maybe I even, heard some kind of an announcement on the radio that the U.S. had dropped an atom bomb on Japan. That was the first one, so that was about the 7th of August, and I guess the second bomb was a week or so later, and that's when we all figured we weren't going to Japan. And I'm guessing, but I don't know, that's probably about the time we turned our cannon in. I think until then, we still had them with us in our, what they call it? There's a term, and I don't remember. The Army had basically a parking lot where you parked all the vehicles for a unit, and because we were an artillery unit, our 4105 howitzers were in that little lot also. And as I said, it's about probably the time the Army figured they weren't going to need them. I assume there was always some concern about whether the Russians were going to behave or not. When we had to bomb and they didn't, I think the general feeling was the Russians would behave, whatever they might have had in mind. I have another comment about the Russians, and this is it's secondhand. I think, because I was naive, I never knew anything about the politics, but there were communist sympathizers probably all over Czechoslovakia, certainly in the areas that the Russian army had captured. There were political people who went with the right along behind the Russian army and started organizing the Czechs, and I have a book written by a Czech who turns out to be Madeleine Albright's father, called something about Czechoslovakia in 1945 to 1948 and the takeover of the country by the communists. And certainly, as I started to say, in the area that the Russian army controlled, they organized the Czech people also. Now, the secondhand stuff that I have comes from a man who had been a major at that time with one of the infantry battalions, and he had some first-hand experiences. And one was, he was in Pilsen, maybe July, and there was a meeting on the square, and they elected a mayor by a show of hands for Pilsen. And turns out the communists had invited their friends, but they forgot to mention it to anyone else, so a voice vote or a show of hands was effective in getting a mayor elected in Pilsen. And I guess in all the towns that I must have been in, there were communists organizing the people. And what I'm getting to is kind of a long, shaggy dog story, but Matt would know about this for sure. But I think it was October before the Russians and the Americans came to an agreement about when the two armies would withdraw from Czechoslovakia. And I think my guess is that the chain of command of all the communist organizers in Czechoslovakia informed the Russian government that they either had or would have the country under control, and it was safe to pull the Russian army out. And I really believe that's when the agreement occurred. But sometimes I pull wild ass guesses out of, but I don't think the Russians did anything lightly, and they were a lot more political than the Americans were. So I suspect they thought they had things wrapped up when they agreed to pull out.
Did you get any sense among the Czechoslovakian populace that this was coming? Were they asking questions?
I didn't personally. The only thing I know is that when the Czechs found out, especially the ones close to the demarcation line, who may have already had experiences with the Russians, they were not happy, because one of my friends told me that some Czech woman pled with them not to leave because they were really scared, at least of some of the Russian troops. And I don't know anything about the conduct of the Russian troops while they were in Czechoslovakia. I have a feeling some probably behaved, and some, perhaps more of them than of us, misbehaved, enough to really worry some of the Czechs.
Let me ask you a little bit about your unit to provide some context.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Let me ask you a little bit about your unit.
Oh,
Put this
okay.
in context. Did you get into the war? What was your role in the unit, and what was the unit's purpose?
Okay. I had a varied career in the Army. I had just barely managed to squeak out a degree. In fact, graduation was after I was in the Army. But I had a bachelor's degree in chemistry when I got drafted. And I was supposed to go to the medical corps, but there was a friend at Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis, which is where I went into the Army.